Hi everyone, I'm Jim. I'm the Animal Behaviour Management Officer for ZSL in the UK, and I've got this amazing opportunity to talk to you all about a project that I was involved with quite a few years ago, back in 2016, with colleagues in ZSL in India, specifically with Asiatic lions, and it was to do with us building a brand new Asiatic lion breeding facility here at London called Land of the Lions. And we had this opportunity to work with partners in India, conservation partners, on a project that was essentially a workshop to build capacity for behaviour management and conservation breeding over with our colleagues in the Sasaberg Zoo in Gujarat. And I have to say, it was one of the highlights of my career. Now, it's a long time ago now, but Lizzie Durkin, one of the board members of the ABMA, must have seen this presentation a while back and remembered it and asked if I could do a recorded version for you for Behaviour Month. And so here we are. And hopefully you'll enjoy seeing some of the experiences that we had over in India a few years ago. So there was a memorandum of understanding signed between ZSL, the Gujarat Forest Department, and the Wildlife Institute of India, and these were to be the three organisations that were coming together to support Asiatic lion conservation in India. Had four major components, and they were patrol-based monitoring, which was overseen by the ZSL Conservation Programs team. Wildlife health, so the One Health approach, and that was done by the ZSL Wildlife Health Services Department. And an education element to try and increase understanding of human-animal conflict and what people can do over in India, and that was between the education team at ZSL and our partners in India. And then the bit that I was involved with, along with two of my colleagues, Malcolm, our curator of mammals, and Graham Williamson, who's now over in Banham Zoo, Africa Alive actually. And this was all to do with conservation, breeding, and animal husbandry. And so this was the group of people that was got together in a beautiful day in SASAN gear over in the Gujarat state in India. And I am tucked away in there. You can just about see my little face there. And just look how delighted I was to be part of this amazing project. Couldn't believe my luck. So we headed off to the Gujarat state in the west of India, and specifically to a region in the south called the Gir Forest, which is the home to the remaining population of Asiatic lions in the world. Now, back in the early 1900s, these were in a critical state. There was possibly as few as 20 individuals left in the entire world, and so there was a huge effort to protect this species from extinction, and this was achieved through the collaborative efforts of organisations such as the Wildlife Institute of India and the Gujarat Forest Department in recent years. And it's just been an incredible conservation success story, and the current numbers are in the wild. The latest census is around 600, which is just an incredible achievement in about 100 years. So with this increase in population, greater support was needed in terms of patrol-based monitoring, and also to give some new ideas and concepts to some of the animals that were housed either in permanent captivity or in temporary captivity due to human-animal conflict. And that's where my part of the project came in with my colleagues. So if you've never been to India before, it is an absolutely extraordinary assault on the senses. The sights and colours and sounds are just so different to what we're used to, and I had never been before. So for me, it was a huge eye-opener. And this is what it looked like when we first travelled to India and spent a couple of days travelling from the UK to the Gir Forest. So after several hours of travelling, we ended up here in the Gir Forest, and it's an absolutely beautiful location. And this was going to be our home for the next 2 weeks during the course of our workshop. The first place that we visited was the rescue centre in SASAN Gir, which is a village right on the cusp of the Gir Forest, home to the remaining population of the Asiatic lions. And this is a fantastic place, and it's a home to some of the most incredible people I've ever met. They're known as the Lion Queens of Gir, or the Lion Queens of Gujarat, and their job is to rescue animals that have either come into human-animal conflict or are trapped in things like wells that are dug into the local neighbourhood. And this is quite a frequent occurrence, and you'll see in the video the way that these incredibly brave people are able to go down the wells in these small cages and anaesthetize the animals in order to bring them back to the surface. Now, in India, they have an incredible system with animals that are in human-animal conflict, and that is essentially a 3 strikes and out. So if there's 2 events of human-animal conflict between people and lions or leopards, they are relocated. But on the 3rd time, there's obviously a problem with that animal, and they are then placed into permanent captivity. And you'll see one of the enclosures in this video of leopards that are in permanent captivity, and it was one of the areas that our colleagues in India wanted us to discuss and see if we could help with. First of all, you'll see that there's some incredible facilities here. The vet team do a fantastic job, and they have great facilities in order to do that. And this is the cages I was talking about, and one of those amazing individuals that are one of the Lion Queens of Gir. And you can see just how amazing this would be if you were stuck in a well with one of these guys here, one of these leopards staring at you in the face and pretty angry. So this is one of the enclosures that I was mentioning before. This is a lion, a young lion, that's actually been relocated. So it's in a cage getting ready to be moved back to the wild. And here we are, me and Malcolm, the curator of mammals, deep in discussion with one of our brilliant colleagues over there from the Wildlife Institute called Sitendu Goswami. And we were discussing some of the things that we could potentially do to enhance the lives, the welfare of the animals that were in permanent captivity. So this was one of our first tasks, which was to redevelop some of those enclosures where leopards were housed in permanent captivity. And essentially, we were using materials that we could find in the local vicinity, because we didn't have a huge budget, and we weren't able to ship anything over from the UK, apart from some simple enrichment devices. So we were able to go out into the forest and cut some timber, and able to add some simple enclosure modifications and cage furnishings in order to redevelop some of those enclosures that housed big cats in permanent captivity. And then we headed to what was going to be the headquarters of the Conservation, Breeding and Behaviour Management Workshop. And this was the Sasaberg Zoo in the Gujarat state, in a city called Junagadh. And you can just see that over here where the arrow's pointing. Now, this is the place where they house many lions that have been in human-animal conflict, and they also have a really good breeding program there. And this has resulted in them having around 60 individual Asiatic lions within the footprint of the zoo. The zoo itself is very old, and so we were being asked to, although focus on the Asiatic lion project, we also had an idea to support the team in some behaviour management modifications of the enclosures, and adding some enriched feeding or some of those different opportunities with some of the other animals at the Sasaberg Zoo. Prior to leaving for India, we'd had a series of meetings over a long period with our partners in the Wildlife Institute. And they'd actually employed an individual to conduct a series of behaviour observations to produce a report which would then inform our work during the workshop. And this person was Sitendu, who you saw in the picture at the end of the SASAN Rescue Centre video. And what he identified through all of his studies was that there was some of these animals, particularly the ones that had shared access to paddocks, were exhibiting repetitive behaviours, apathy, and just an overall lack of behavioural diversity. So these are all highlighted, and so we decided to focus in on 3 or 4 of those different enclosures. And actually, when we worked out how much time we had for this workshop, we thought, let's just focus on one pair, and this was in enclosure A2. As you can see, it's got good vegetation, but there was no enrichment provision. And then we would try and use that as a case study. We'd work with the team in teams from the Wildlife Institute, the Gujarat Forest Department, and also the zookeepers, and we'd collaborate and figure out a way of enhancing the welfare of these animals through behaviour management. And the way that these animals are managed generally was quite simple. They have a small off-show den, and then they have this area where they can go out. And it's not always on show. They do tours through that area. But what it means is that they tended to feed the animals in the inside areas. So they were never given enriched feeding opportunities outside. And the reason for that is they needed to move the animals inside frequently in order to give the shared access to the paddocks. There was also a rule that they weren't allowed to feed meat on the bone either, and this was due to the feeling that there could be a risk. So we needed to speak to the director of Sakaburg Zoo, and we consulted with our nutritionist here at ZSL, and we provided evidence that this was going to be a good idea to start offering meat in a slightly different way, both outside and in an enriched feeding way. Before we went, we also did a little bit of our own research by giving our own lions at ZSL some other enrichment opportunities as well, which I'll show you now. So in 2015, while we were rebuilding the lion exhibit at the London Zoo, which was going to be home to our 3 Asiatic lionesses, we moved them from London to Whipsnade, and we'd built a holding facility off-show in one of our large areas at Whipsnade Zoo, and this is the inside facility here. And as you can see, we were able to offer different types of enrichment and non-naturalistic and zip lines, and so it really did inform what we were going to try and offer our colleagues in terms of advice and recommendations for the project in the Sakaburg Zoo. And this is a video, just a short video, showing a couple of the enrichment techniques that we were planning on using over in Sakaburg. And the first one is just a simple paper bag stuffed with smelly items like hay and other sacks. There's no meat or food in there. It was just an olfactory and physical novel enrichment item that we offered and evaluated. And they really liked it. So the zipline thing really works, that movement. Then we were able to offer some carcass feeds that were on bungee ropes, and we offered 3 of them, so 1 per lion, so there was no conflict. And in that video you can see some of the most dynamic feeding behaviors that I've ever seen with lions in captivity, and you can see every single muscle and sinew being worked, and it's one of my favorite examples of an animal in the zone when it's almost looks like it's on a hunt. It's an amazing video to watch. So and this really inspired us for when we were moving out to India to develop our workshop. In this video, you can see all the different partners involved in this workshop. So ZSL, the Wildlife Institute of India, the Gujarat Forest Department, plus all those keepers from the Sakarberg Zoo, all working together, collaborating and adding things to the environment to provide greater behavioural diversity for the focal pair of lions that we talked about before. And so in this video, you'll see things like blood trails, scent marking with ginger and other spices. And then you'll see us hanging up the zip lines and bungee ropes or bungees for enriched feeding opportunities. And then you get to see the lions. So first of all, you see some different behaviours, so scent marking, which they hadn't emitted before in these conditions. And then you start to see the feeding behaviours. And what was interesting about this is that we watched these lions for quite a while, and because there was such a big crowd of people watching, they were very wary of doing anything new. Remember, they'd never had enriched feeding opportunities. All they'd had was flesh off the bone placed in their inside dens. And so this was a very, very big novel experience, plus being watched meant that they didn't actually interact with these items until everyone left. But Sitendu stayed, and he stayed with a colleague, and they watched from a distance. And that's when you start to see some of those really brilliant behaviours that you associate with lions first getting used to, actually all cats first getting used to novel items in their environment, especially ones that move and react. And it's really interesting to watch. It almost reminds me of your cat at home, your pet cat, engaging with something novel. So you'll see that. And then what you'll notice is that halfway through some of those feeding behaviours, they stop and they start to interact with conspecifics that are in an adjacent enclosure. And that was really unusual. Sitendu said he'd never seen that during his study period. So they were in a state of arousal, but in a good way, and they were interacting with different environmental stimulus in their environment, in their habitat. And then at the end, you see them really tired out. Now, this video is edited down from literally hours of footage that Sitendu provided, and so it just shows the increase in behavioural diversity on just day one of our interventions.
Inside this drill a hole and make that
ऊपर देख रही है, एक बार मुंह मारा वापस छोड़ दिया। सर हो रहा है सर। हाँ सर आ गए, दोनों वाले दोनों आ गए वहाँ पर। मैं वीडियो कर रहा हूँ उस तरफ जिप लाइन वाले। ठीक है, अच्छा। अरे हाँ बढ़िया है सर, इधर एकदम परफेक्ट। अरे वाह वाह वाह, फैंटास्टिक। थोड़ा सा अरे क्या वाह, मजा आ गया अकेले में। बस गुड। अरे बाप,
So after the workshop, Sitendu spent a lot of time studying the animals again and then analysing the data that he collected. And I can't really do justice to the incredible report that he created for the partners in the MOU. But just to kind of, really summarise this crudely, he defined the animals that were curious as ones that during the pre-workshop study period had presented behaviours that he would consider interacting or seeking interaction with people that were walking past, generally interested in what was going on outside of their own habitat, and then non-curious animals as essentially ones that tended to keep themselves to themselves, in a very unscientific term. So they would stay at the back of the enclosure and they wouldn't seek out any interaction or be interested in what was going on outside the habitat. But in both those study sets, and this is with many lions that he studied in 5 or 6 different enclosures, you can see that there was a statistically significant increase in species typical behavior diversity, whether the animal was essentially a curious animal or a non-curious animal by their definition. So it was considered a huge success, and there is far more data that we're always happy to share with anyone that's interested. So that was the lions part of it, and we did a lot more stuff during the workshop, but we also, with the lions I mean, but we also had this amazing opportunity to walk around the zoo with the fantastic director and look at some of his areas that he highlighted as having animals in that he really liked, and potentially ones that potentially could use a little bit of support in terms of new behavior management strategies. And so this enclosure here, as you can see in this image, is the pheasant enclosure at the Zuckerberg Zoo, and there was a series of them, about 10 or 15 in a row, and we knew that we only had about 2.5 hours, 3 hours and one afternoon to redevelop one of these enclosures, so we couldn't do the whole lot. We thought we'd do one, and this was one of the purposes of the workshop, was to create a cultural change, by developing this collaborative effort, so that it wasn't ZSL or the Gujarat Forest Department dictating on what was going on. It was a collaborative effort where everyone had an input. The idea being is at the end of the workshop we built capacity, so the keepers at Zuckerberg Zoo could continue and continue to develop some of these behaviour management recommendations from the workshop. So this was one example of species that we decided to help with.
But even from a visitor perspective, from the visitor point of view.
So this was before, and this is after. And again, just like the leopard example that I showed you before, we had no budget. So all we did was we found materials that were already in the zoo, and then we were able to go into the local forest and find some other materials, some naturalistic materials. We had some bamboo and bamboo planters, and then we were able to cut some bamboo. And the idea being is just to add some screening, some naturalistic perching and some substrates. And what we saw immediately after we'd finished was the animals, all the pheasants that were, the pair of pheasants that were in that one enclosure there, their behaviour diversity just completely changed. They were doing things like pecking through the ground, they were bathing in the sand, perching at height. So all these things were new behaviours for the animals. And it was really lovely to see, especially sharing that with Mr. Tiagi, who was the person in the picture who I was talking to before, along with the team leader of birds. So again, you know, creating this this cultural change within Zuckerberg Zoo that could be continued after the workshop. And one of the things we noticed immediately was the increased dwell time of visitors. Now, they would just walk along that run of pheasants and not stop at all, but except for the one that we'd modified, because partly because the animals were doing interesting things, but also because the habitat just looked a little bit nicer. And so that was a really good a good message to pass on to our colleagues in the Zuckerberg Zoo, and had a real impact. And we were really really happy with the outcome of that very simple and cheap enclosure modification. In the meantime, my colleagues Graham and Malcolm were working in different areas of the zoo, focusing on mammals. And one of the areas that Graham focused on was with small mammals, where, for example, this Indian squirrel. And all the mammal enclosures had no cage furnishings at all, really, just maybe one or two branches. And so Graham set to work with the team there and added in lots and lots of arboreal pathways and different opportunities for enriched feeding, which really did have a significant impact in the short term, and again enabled because it was a collaborative effort, these continued after the workshop finished. And this was specifically with callitrichids, this example. So the workshop was over too quick. We were there for 10 days, and the actual time we were working with the teams in the zoo was really limited, just 5 days in total. But we learnt so much, and we shared so many brilliant experiences with our friends and colleagues over in India. We were able to go out into the Gir forest and see some of these amazing species, serpent eagles and owlets and Asiatic lions suckling their young. And the people were just extraordinary, so welcoming, so knowledgeable about nature and their own habitats around them, and which birds and other animals lived there. It was just one of the most mind-blowing experiences of my life, and I'll be forever grateful that I got that opportunity to share that with our colleagues in India and my colleagues also at ZSL. And then it was all over and we were back home. But we had another exciting opportunity, because back in London, Land of the Lions, the big new exhibit that was due to house our females that you saw being enriched up at Whipsnade Zoo by my colleagues Graham and the team there. And we had an opportunity to provide and use the experiences that we learnt in India with our own animals. Now, one thing I would say is that if you ever get the opportunity as a zookeeper and animal caregiver to experience what life is like in the wild for the animals that you look after, it just gives you such an incredible understanding and an in-depth knowledge of how these animals exist in the wild, the conditions, the environmental conditions that they live under. And I think it just really informs you and inspires you to do a better job for your own animals at home. And so we tried our best with the Asiatic lions living in London, but it was a great exhibit. We made mistakes at the beginning because we didn't give them enough time to habituate to the new surroundings or let the live plants grow. But by the end of the summer, we started to see brilliant signs that our understanding of these species was growing, and we started to see some really lovely natural behaviours. And in this video, you can see our public being able to see how close, close-up experience with these animals, some nice novel enrichment items that they were engaging with. For me, I just love when the habitat starts to bloom and the live planting, which our horticulture team at ZSL do such a fantastic job with. It really does help the natural screening and plants. We started to see some really lovely social behaviours with our lionesses, and they would just be so close to our public. We were really lucky, and the habitat we gave them, although could have been improved, was actually really good, and started to demonstrate that it was a great place for these lions to live. And then Banu, our male lion, came in from Canada, and he took a while to settle, but one of the ways that we got him used to his new surroundings and got him ready to be introduced to the females was by using some of those simple enriched feeding techniques that we trialed with our animals at Whipsnade and then seen in the Zuckerberg Zoo being implemented to such great effect. So we started off giving him bungees and zip lines in his off-show area, and then gradually we took that out into the outside space until he would be in front of lots and lots of people enjoying his enriched feeding opportunities. This moat, by the way, is designed actually to keep the lions in. So when they started swimming, we were like, wow, that's not what we expected. But it showed that they were increasing in their behavioural diversity all the time. And gradually, over time, we were able to introduce Banu to our 3 females. And although these animals, the females are no longer at London Zoo, they moved over to a zoo in Germany, and we had a fantastic period of time housing these 4 animals together in our Land of the Lions exhibit. And actually, when we opened to the public way back in March of that year, so 2016, we opened, the Queen opened the exhibit, so it was a really important moment for us, a royal opening event. But what was even nicer was that on that day, on the day that the Queen opened the zoo, we were able to invite some of our partners from the Wildlife Institute of India to join us in that special day. And here you can see Mr. Tyagi, who is our lead Wildlife Institute representative over in India and who organised everything brilliantly for us while we stayed in India. He had the opportunity to meet the Queen, and we spent a fantastic couple of weeks with Mr. Tyagi and his colleagues. And in the background there you can see Gitanjali, who was the project leader from ZSL and was just such a fantastic advocate for implementing behaviour management beyond our own zoos. And so I'm eternally grateful for the support of Gitanjali and her team in making this project a reality. So what was the legacy? Well, a year later, I got this incredible opportunity to go back to the Zuckerberg Zoo on different business. We were looking at some lions to come in to support the breeding program, the European breeding program. But while I was there, I had this chance to walk around the zoo on my own, and everywhere I went, I started to see some changes, some significant impacts from the year before. So first of all, every single lion enclosure had these platforms that we designed during the workshop, but never got the opportunity to build. Then there was new and improved enriched feeding opportunities in every single lion enclosure. And beyond that,
yeah, it's absolutely fantastic.
There was changes in, for example, that squirrel enclosure I showed you had more arboreal pathways and different ways for the animals to get around. Still very simple and of course needs improvement, but was significantly better. This enclosure had been repurposed from a mammal enclosure, a primate enclosure, into a snake enclosure. These were essentially new snake tanks, and they used to be housed in small pits. So that was a big improvement. And where they were building new enclosures that essentially were for large primates like this was going to be for ring-tailed lemurs. Instead, they started to house smaller birds, things like passerines. This was a new enclosure made ready for cheetah, and I don't think there's a much more naturalistic cheetah enclosure I've ever seen in a zoo before. Near my colleague Ty, the vet, talking there. She's from South Africa and knows a thing or two about cheetahs. This was the new ring-tailed lemur enclosure, so instead of being in that smaller area that I showed you before, they were now going to be housed in a big open-topped enclosure. And here's some of the local residents that I got to see: spotted owlets and an Indian sparrowhawk. So it was brilliant to see. I just had this great feeling as I was going around, and it wasn't only the animals that were benefiting from this this sort of cultural shift that was brought about by the workshop. I understood that the keepers had been empowered to do more for their animals, and they were actually being rewarded for some of those additional efforts that they were putting into things like building those platforms for the lions. That was really great to hear, empowered workforce. And just generally speaking, it was just a fantastic thing to see these impacts of the workshop over in India. And the last impact that I wanted to share with you was just something that Gitanjali our colleague, the project leader from ZSL, she actually spoke to our partners over in the Wildlife Institute of India, who manage all the zoos in India. And they were actually using the Zuckerberg Zoo now as a case study and as example to other zoos on how they could improve their behaviour management and animal welfare programs, things like research. So it was overall a significant impact, something I'm so proud to have been involved with. So, you know, it's one of the best things I've ever done in my career. And if you ever get that opportunity to visit another zoo and support ones that are potentially in developing countries, then it's just a fantastic opportunity. I've just got a few thanks here. Please take the time to read them, but particularly to our colleagues in the Wildlife Institute of India and the Gujarat Forest Department, who made our journey to India such a special one. We'll never forget it. Thanks very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Any questions, please email jim.mackie@zsl.org.